Excellent. Thanks, Ray, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning. My name is Steve Needel. I'm the managing partner of Advanced Simulations. We are one of the originators of virtual reality for marketing research. We started in 1993 using software developed by Ray Burke, who's now at Indiana. At the time, he was at Harvard. And we've been doing this a long time, so Ray asked me to talk about things we've learned over time that might help you in doing virtual reality studies. So I'm going to tell you about 3 things that you ought to know. And today we'll start out with thing 1, for those of you who know Cat in the Hat. Virtual reality really does work well for marketing research most of the time. I want to tell you a little bit about what works and what doesn't work. For products, it's easy to test any consumer packaged goods or FMCG product. It's possible to test expensive items, luxury goods, things like wine, things like we've done automobile tires. But you need to use some special instructions to do that so that people don't go off and just buy the highest end thing that not what they'd normally buy. And also, we can do occasion-specific products. We've done studies with alcoholic beverages where we talk about you're stocking up at home versus you're taking a bottle of liquor to a party. Again, doable, you just need special instructions. We do this for all types of in-store applications, whether it's packaging, whether it's pricing, promotions, new products, shelf assortments, shelf layout. We do some work in substitution behavior, which is a great use for virtual reality. You don't have to ask people how they substitute. You just make a product they want go out of stock. And we can do it anywhere in a country that has Windows, which I believe is pretty much anywhere, or anywhere you can put a PC and a shopper together. Now, we should also talk about what doesn't work, because, boy, we found the stuff that doesn't work. Things that require tasting, smell, or touch do not work well in VR yet. I know there's ways to deliver scent to somebody. It's just not a great way to do it at the moment. It doesn't work well for products that would require interaction before you buy it. For example, a cell phone. It's easy for me to show you a cell phone in VR, for you to turn it around. If it was in the days of flip phones, we could make it flip open. But there's still something about holding that phone in your real hand as opposed to your virtual hand that makes a difference. And it does not work well for services. In terms of applications, we don't think it's a great use for advertising because we believe that advertising has long-term effects, not short-term effects. And in virtual reality, you're measuring a short-term effect when you're looking at shopping behavior. It's not good for an initiative where category growth is driven by new shoppers, because why would somebody who doesn't buy a category actually go to your category? That's not something that would naturally happen. It also is not great for an initiative where you're hoping to drive brand growth by increasing how often somebody buys this. Again, we're collapsing time. We often show people 2 or 3 different scenarios in one sitting. But even though we ask them to pretend it's a whole new trip, we don't think we're capturing purchase frequency as well as you would need to for that type of initiative. Our online version does not work well in countries where the internet is sporadic, and unfortunately that's a whole lot more places than we thought it would be. There are many parts of the world where, yes, they have the internet, but is it on for 10, 15 minutes at a time at a high speed? Not so much. It's also not appropriate for countries where central locations are not practical. Excuse me. The second thing I want you to know, the data is different from what you are used to if you haven't done virtual reality studies before. For example, most shoppers in the sample are not going to buy your test brand. We took a study recently where we looked at well over 1,000 people, and you can see that a relatively small number of people bought anything at all. Now, this has implications for your test design when most of your values for purchasing are going to be zeros. We want at least 30 expected test brand buyers per test cell in our studies, although of course we'd like to have more. Now, you can do that by running bigger samples. If I have a 10% incidence product, if I run 300 people, I'll get my expected 30. But we're doing a study today where we're looking at 3 and 4% incidences, and running hundreds and hundreds of people is just not practical. So the other thing we can do, and we did this in this study, is we constrain the sample by only using category buyers. There are still some suppliers out there who perpetrate the myth that you need to have a rep sample. No, you need to have a representative sample, and I use that term loosely, of category buyers when you're trying to see if something you're testing is going to change how they buy. You can also constrain the category buying sample to people who are brand non-rejectors. Again, when we have low incidence, if somebody says, I will never buy Cheerios, it's useless to be testing Cheerios with them because they're not even considering what you're doing. So again, you can tighten your sample up. And at the end, sometimes we just have to augment for test brand users so we can tell them what's going on with that group. The data is different, and it's rare that we find differences at the 95% confidence level. Now, clients used to tell me all the time, yes, Steve, our level of significance is always 95%, and gee, sometimes we'll stretch it a little bit lower. Shopping data doesn't come out that well at 95%, unless what you're doing is completely blowing away the shoppers. Part of the reason it doesn't come out at higher than 95% confidence is that, as you saw, it's a gamma or a negative binomial distribution, and that tends to reduce our typical statistical sensitivity. And trust me when I tell you, transformations don't help the statistics enough to make a difference. The bigger reason that they don't come out at 95% is quite often the things we're testing are often not that large, and we don't expect them to be. As brain juicer, and for the life of me, I'm now blanking on the guy who wrote just a wonderful presentation about this. What we ought to be trying to do in marketing research quite often is changing behavior, and changing behavior is just not that easy. So we may be looking at something that will affect a 2%, 3%, 4% change in shopping behavior. That's why they're quite often not significant at that confidence level. So what do we suggest? We look for patterns of shopping change more than looking for statistical significance per se. We've all heard, and I also mentioned it, we all know that what people say is often not what they do. And virtual reality is different from survey data, so you shouldn't be surprised. It's why you're using a VR study to begin with rather than just doing a typical typical survey. Here's an example from about 130 studies we've done on packaging, where we've looked at and said, in the simulation, is there a sales difference or not due to the packaging? And you see, a little more than half the time, we get a sales difference. We then, in packaging, almost always are asking attribute ratings. How much do you like the package? How appealing is it? Those types of things. In only 60% of the studies is the result from the survey consistent with what the result from the shopping behavior was. So what people say and what they do are not always the same thing. You should obviously rethink that the results are more important than the survey results, in terms of decision making when you're doing a VR study. The third thing you ought to know when you're thinking about doing a VR study and choosing a supplier is it's really not about the technology. Dye has good technology. You're going to see good technology from Jason shortly. We have good technology. It's not a technology argument. What it is whether it actually validates. Whether the system gives you data that actually works and lets you make a correct decision. And you need to see this from multiple categories. There are suppliers out there who will show you a single category because that happens to be the one that validated for them. You should ask to see across a broad spectrum of categories and a broad spectrum of category types. You should see food, you should see drug, you should see household goods, all different types of categories. Validation is for the system you're buying, not a general virtual reality validates. We have done a fair amount of work analyzing other people's data, and it's surprising how many systems we've tested do not produce good validation results. And when you validate, there are two questions you need to be asking your potential supplier. And if you ask me, I have good answers, obviously. Do shoppers buy like they normally buy using this system? And do shoppers respond to marketing stimuli like they normally respond? You also need to be able to create the right psychological environment. There are suppliers out there who will tell you you have to be able to do an entire store walkthrough, even if you're doing it on the computer rather than using some form of headset like Dye was showing you. There is no advantage to store walkthroughs in almost every research question case you have. You get the same kind of data. You just eat up more time and you eat up more cost in doing a store walkthrough, because let me tell you, somebody's paying for building that store walkthrough until you get up to your shelf that you care about, and the answer is you're helping to pay for that. There are exceptions. When we get asked about the stoppability of end-aisle displays, you need to be walking through a store. When we're asked about, gee, do people notice signage throughout the store? You need to be walking through a store. But neither is a particularly good use of virtual reality, because there's not a lot of evidence to date that says people look at a virtual reality environment like they look at a real environment. We're hoping to answer that question shortly with some work we're doing with iFaster, and we think the answer is probably not. While they buy the same as they buy in a real environment, we're not sure they look at it in the same way. It's about letting them shop like they normally shop. So you need to set the scene for them and then ask them to go shopping. There are some suppliers, and Dye mentioned this, that use two-dimensional images. Essentially, they're showing you a picture of a product, whereas we always use three-dimensional images that you can pick up and turn around, move closer to you, read what you want to read, or not read if you don't. I mean, let's face it, if you're buying Cocoa Puffs, who needs to know that it doesn't have that much nutrition? If you want to just use 2D images, just show shoppers pictures, why pay for virtual reality? And the other side of that argument is shoppers use information on the sides and backs of packages all the time. And the rumor is that they're doing that more and more often. Why would you take that away? And more important, why would you risk altering their shopping behavior? Finally, I think you need to hire a supplier to do this who understands, first of all, the boundaries of the technology. Having done this for so long, we know what doesn't work in virtual reality, and we don't let you do it. You need somebody who understands experimental research. Like I said, this is not survey work, it's experiment work, and there are things you need to understand about experiments that are different from what you need to understand about surveys. You ought to be hiring somebody who understands how the research will be used and what your business issues are and how to turn the data into action. And that's as appropriate for virtual reality as it is for any study you're doing. You should always be looking for a supplier who knows what you're doing, what your issues are, and how you're going to use the data at the end of the day. So, my 3 things to know about virtual reality that we've learned over 23 years. It works well for marketing research most of the time. The data is different from what you're used to, and it's not about the technology. And I thank you for spending the time with me.